there's a direct comparison to the campus. That's why you can line them up side by side. And so I'm looking at, for 2020, I don't have the campus rates on that grid, but so we were 74% for that 1 year, right? And what that 1 year means, if you look at 2020 and you look out to the left, it says freshman cohort of 2013-14, right? So that's the group that came in to the university fall of 2013, the 13-14 academic year. And what the federal graduation rate does is it says what percentage of those students that came in that year graduated within 6 years. It's a 6-year window, right? So the answer for us was 74%. And the way that rate gets calculated, and it'd be the same if you were talking athletics or the campus, is it's who comes in, and then you have to graduate within 6 years. And so if somebody transfers out, right? So Joseline, you're a good example. Like, anybody who transfers, like the institution that you left from gets dinged, right? You don't count in their graduation rate because you didn't graduate from that institution. And here's the weird part. At the same time, you coming to UIC, you'll never, this is strange. You will never factor into UIC's graduation rate because you didn't start here. They only count the people that started here. Why? You have to ask the Department of Education. It makes no sense. Because you're a really good example. Like if you come here, you graduate, you ought to count somewhere. Because the way the formula is done, you don't factor into anybody's graduation rate, which makes no sense, at least to me. So the graduation success rate, the GSR, that's the NCAA's version, because they looked at that exact dynamic and said, this is nuts. This doesn't make any sense. So what they do is they look at, they not only count those that start at a particular school, but they count the student athletes who then transfer in and then ultimately graduate, right? And they also recognize the athletic dynamic to an athletic graduation rate. We have lots of students who they come here for all kinds of reasons. They get here and then they look around and go, you know what, I'm third on the depth chart at my position. And I came to school to play in part, right? I want my degree, but I also came to play sports and I'm sitting on the bench. I'm going to transfer and go somewhere where I can play. The graduation success rate doesn't penalize the institution for the student who says, you know what, I'm going to transfer. I'm going to go graduate at this school, but because I want to play, because it's not an academic reason for transferring. So generally you'll see that the GSR is higher, and that's the reason why because it's got these other factors in there. It's counting people who later come in later in their career and then ultimately graduate. And it's not penalizing the institution for somebody who leaves because they wanted to play somewhere and then they graduate from that other institution. So you'll see, and I think, you can see it's almost like 10 percentage points higher thereabouts on average. But that's why. There's no you can't compare the GSR to like UIC doesn't have a GSR because it's an athletic metric. It's an NCAA metric. But if you look at the FGR, the federal graduation rate, that's the one it's kind of apples to apples. The one thing that I would point out that's not apples to apples about any of this, the only student athletes that are counted, this is just for student athletes, in either of those rates are scholarship student athletes, which is a huge distinction. So, and again, I was a walk-on tennis player. So I graduated in 4 years at Maryland. I don't factor into their graduation rates because I didn't have a scholarship. It's another nuance to this. So when you look at UIC's overall student graduation rate, they're not only looking at scholarship, no matter what scholarship you're on, whether it's merit-based or need-based or whatever it is, it's just whoever comes in the fall. For whatever reason, they don't do that with student athletes. I think years ago that the mindset was, well, we really care about those scholarship athletes because those are kind of the high level athletes, and we want to see how they're doing, right? And they don't, for whatever reason, it's almost like, well, we don't care. The walk-ons, maybe because they didn't earn a scholarship, they must not be as high level athlete. And so for some reason, we're not tracking on them as closely, which, doesn't make a lot of sense to me. We have 300 student athletes, roughly half are on scholarship. The other half are not. It's kind of the way that all this works. So in any given year, half of our student athletes that are doing all kinds of great things, they're not even factored into our rates. But they're not factored into rates. This is the way this is calculated all across the country, right? So there's like I said, there's a lot of nuance there, but those are just a couple things to be aware of. APR, I won't bore you with the calculation because it's messy. It started in 2004. It was the first time APR came into being. What was happening was the NCAA looked around and said, because it's the 6-year window for grad rates, you report a rate. And let's say a school reports a graduation rate, and let's say it was terrible. Let's say a school said, we have a 40% graduation rate, and everybody freaked out on that campus and said, well, that's just terrible. We got to do something. The problem is that rate is it's 7 years ago, because those, that group came in, they had 6 years to graduate, and then the information gets reported the following year. So it's a 7-year trailing average. So by the time the data comes out, it's not actionable, right? Because it's 7 years old. And then you already know what your next year's data is going to be, because it was 6 years ago. So the APR was meant to be kind of a real-time snapshot. So what they do is every student athlete, and again, only applies to scholarship student athletes, but every scholarship student athlete on your roster, you get 2 points, right? So we'll use basketball because it's a small roster. Or let's just use tennis because that's even easier. Women's tennis has 8 scholarships, okay? So 8 women's tennis players, each has 2 points assigned to them each semester. So 16 in the fall, 16 in the spring, 32 total points. The points are for you're eligible at the end of the semester. And then the second one is retention. You returned. So student, if you two were both tennis players, you showed up in the fall, at the end of the fall, you're eligible, and you returned in the spring, UIC gets 2 points for each of you. Okay. So if you just apply that for the whole year, those 8 tennis players, 32 points. If you get 32 for 32, they convert it, for whatever reason, they convert it to 1,000. Like you batted 1,000. And that's why you see those numbers of like 983, 988, because somewhere along the line, you lost a point or two. Otherwise, you'll see 1,000. If you get 1,000, it's perfect. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to show in real time at the end of a particular year that you're losing somebody because they were not eligible academically, or you didn't retain them. They left for whatever reason. Maybe they transferred, maybe they dropped out of school. That's what they're looking at. Because then you can say, okay, well, now we see on this team, well, we didn't post 1,000, we posted an 850. What happened? And you're looking at real-time data, and you can actually respond to it rather than this 7-year trailing average of graduation rates. It's not a great formula. There's all kinds of nuance there. There's been a lot written about it. If you Google APR, you can find all kinds of stuff. But that's kind of how it's made. And so that's why those numbers are, they don't really, it's a strange number when you look at it. You're like, what's a 983? What's a 950? The main thing to keep in mind is 1,000 is perfect. And the schools that post 1,000, they do this on a sport basis. So if you look at our women's tennis, again, is a very high academic achieving team. Pretty much most years they post 1,000, 1,000, 1,000. And then the department gets this score you're seeing here is the department number, which is like all the teams rolled together. It's basically an average of averages, which is bad math, but that's how they do it. That's kind of how that works. So 1,000 is perfect. 930 is the other number to know for APR. In the NCAA's world, a 930 is going to equate to, if you stay above a 930, that equates on average to about a 75% graduation rate over 4 years. So that's kind of where they set the threshold. And they said, okay, if you stay above that, you're graduating roughly 3/4 of your scholarship student athletes. That's a good range to be in at most colleges. If you drop below a 930, this is the reason why everybody pays attention to APR. The NCAA can start to implement penalties. The biggest penalties being they can start docking you scholarships, and they can start banning you from the postseason. So let's say